off.
Sorry, I just wanted to try something.
Yeah, that worked.
Meeting. And we'll give a few more minutes for folks to join. They have to do a registration page and all that kind of stuff, and they should be able to join. So in the meanwhile, thank you very much for those who are here joining, friends of AutoMobility Advisors, friends of EXL, LinkedIn connections. Thank you very much for being interested in our topic today. This is one of our first webinars on connected vehicle data. We think this is a very interesting topic. We hope you enjoy the content. My name is George Ayres. I'm the Managing Director of AutoMobility Advisors, and I will be your moderator today. And I have some guests with me listed on the page. First of all, Chip Goetzinger, the Solutions Director of AutoMobility Advisors. Hey, Chip. Allen Levenson, a Director of Data and Analytics at AutoMobility Advisors. Hey, Allen.
Good morning.
And Dan Teeter, the Advisory Director of AutoMobility Advisors.
Good morning, everyone.
And our special guest, Neikhil Agrawal, who's the practice leader for media and manufacturing at EXL Service. Hey, Neikhil.
Thank you, George. How are you?
Thank you for joining. So thanks for everyone joining. We're going to go through some of the materials that have been prepared. I'm going to ask some questions of our guests, and then we'll reserve some time for audience questions as well. The method for that will be in the chat function, and our friend Dan Teeter will be monitoring the chat for those kinds of questions. So please, along the way, submit your questions in chat. Dan will capture those, and we'll get to those towards the end. So why don't we begin? So first, just a word on AutoMobility Advisors. Who are we and what do we do? We basically focus on auto technology and helping startups, mid-size, and even larger companies create opportunities within automotive technology. And we focus on these areas, sometimes for investors, strategic advice, marketing, business development, and program execution. And now a word about EXL. EXL is a global data and analytics company with many employees. You see that over 55,000 employees, 800 plus customers, a lot of great recognition about their key capabilities and their partnerships with almost every technology company that is in this space. So we're really excited to have Neikhil talk about EXL a little bit later. Thank you. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Chip and the team to talk a little bit about the state of connected data and how it's being thought about and how we recommend it should be utilized and processed. So go ahead, Chip.
Well, thanks. We're actually going to start off with Allen.
Oh, okay, great, Allen.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for George for that. So what I wanted to do was provide a little bit of context for why this webinar is taking place and the proper ways to use and collect data, connected vehicle data. In order to do that, thought it might be helpful first to provide just a little bit of background of how we got to where we are today. So if you think about our industry, connected data, it really started in 1996 with General Motors with OnStar. And now back then, it wasn't managing enormous databases of data. It was connected to the vehicle where you had a little blue button you could push. You still have that today, allowed you to talk to a human being who, if you had an accident, could provide you help if you wanted in a pre-GPS world, turn-by-turn directions. So you were now connected. By the way, you'd be surprised how many people, it declines every year, but how many still use the turn-by-turn directions. So that was kind of where the industry was for much of its first couple of decades. Then as big data became a thing and it became easier to manage these, and I say easier, it is still very challenging managing these databases, which, by the way, are some of the largest data sets in the world. I mean, think about I used to work at General Motors in the chief data and analytics office. Think about 15, 20 million vehicles that you're pulling down thousands of data elements, some of them as often as every 3 seconds. So just enormous databases. Honestly, why we need companies like Neikhil, EXL and Neikhil to help manage that. So in 2016, McKinsey wrote a white paper, did a lot of research, got a fair amount of publicity, talking about the enormous potential for connected vehicle data, upwards of $750 billion of value from both companies internally monetizing the data as well as externally selling it. Quite frankly, that's the reason I ended up at General Motors. The whole reason they built this centralized data and analytics function was as a result of this McKinsey study. So that kind of happened in 2016. A lot of focus over the last 7-8 years on companies trying to use the data to bring new products and services to life. 2022, I'd kind of call that a new phase. A lot of the companies started telling Wall Street, quite frankly, that they were working to have 10, 20, as much as $30 billion of incremental high margin revenues by the end of this decade from software enabled services, things not made of steel, which is where traditionally they've made their money. One could argue they were trying to get a little bit more of that Tesla-like valuation into their stocks by showing that this is what they do. But it really is an enormous opportunity. And that kind of gets us to where we are today. There really is a bright future for leveraging connected vehicle data, whether it'll be 200 million or 750, billion or 750 by the end of the decade, I'm not sure, but certainly enormous opportunities. That said, it doesn't come without risks, and it will be potentially and has been a little bit of a bumpy road along the way. And if you could go to the next page, that kind of gets us to where we are today and why this webinar is taking place. So, case in point, earlier this year, there was a couple of articles, in this case in the New York Times, about companies having some issues with the way they're collecting their data. And the one on the left happened to be a place I know well. I'm no longer there at General Motors. And the article talked about apparently them selling data to third parties who were using that to determine a driving score on customers. Things like how quickly customers are driving and fast starts and hard stops and when they drive, and selling that to insurance companies who were then using it to set rates. And apparently people were not aware that this was happening. And I guess according to the article, people would see when their policy lapsed and turned over, they were seeing some very significant increases. And when they dug in, it turns out that they had from this score, even though they had not had an accident or a ticket, which historically had been used to change premiums. So, and I will say within a couple of weeks after this came out, apparently General Motors stopped selling the data in this case. So there's been some other articles. So that got us to, yes, there's promise. Yes, there's a lot of upside, but we need to do it properly. And I'll now turn it over to Chip, who will give you some thoughts on how to do that.
Yeah, so after a lot of this news came to light back in the spring, so we talked about it internally, and Alan and I put together a white paper to provide a little bit of guidance and maybe a framework for how to approach collecting and utilizing and monetizing customer data in a way that is responsible both from a customer standpoint and from an OEM standpoint. We really do believe that the future of connected mobility and data generated by connected mobility is really exciting. There is a lot of potential there. There have been bumps in the road. You know, that initial McKinsey study that said there's all this money out there got people very excited. And then there have been, of course, challenges along the way how to realize that value. But there really is a lot of potential value in that data that's being generated. That data can enable new services for customers that you never would have contemplated 20 years ago. You know, we've gotten accustomed to the fact that you can just talk to your car and tell it you want to go to a local restaurant and it will tell you how to get there. But there are so many types of services that can be enabled with the data being generated today that it's really exciting from a customer standpoint. It's also great from a larger perspective. You know, we can increase safety by appropriate utilization of data. We can reduce traffic by helping people find alternate routes and not running everybody through the same roads. We can make payments for services and for other goods easier by embedding capabilities in the vehicles. There's a lot of things that we can do, but you know, as we're seeing in some of the you know, the press and the stories that Allen mentioned, it's really, really critical that we ensure that the data is collected and utilized responsibly. So we've come up with 7 rules that provide a framework for OEMs who are interested in using collected data, which is basically all OEMs. I won't go through all 7 of them individually on this slide. We're going to go touch on each one as we go. So the first section of these rules addresses the question, should OEMs sell customer data, right? So the first thing you've got to ask when collecting this data is, should I even be looking at this particular piece of data or this use case or this monetization case? Does it make sense from a lot of perspectives? Especially if it's PII. If this is personally identifiable information, there's got to be a responsible review of, should I even do anything with this data? And that's both from a legal standpoint as well as an ethical standpoint. So the first rule, and is kind of the foundational table stakes rule, is legal considerations. You've always got to follow not only federal, but local laws and regulations. This sounds very simple. It's an absolute minimum requirement, but even adhering to this one, you know, takes some effort. This requires not only an analysis when you first look at a use case, but this requires regular reviews. The laws are changing, expectations are changing, and they're changing in many different jurisdictions. So you've got a set of laws, GDPR in Europe. You've got CCPA, which became CPRA in California. You've got other states in the US adopting these. The network of different regulations in different jurisdictions is a constantly moving target, and you've got to stay on top of this. So this means not only when I first start the program, but anytime there are changes to regulations, I've got to reevaluate. If I want to change that program, I've got to evaluate again against the backdrop of current regulatory environment and projected future regulatory environment. This may be fine to do from a legal standpoint today, but there are discussions and changes on the horizon. Is this something I think, hey, might be all right for the next 6 months or the next year? But it's likely that regulations are going to change in that time frame and make this, you know, something that I can't do legally. So that's really kind of our baseline. Next, I'll pitch to Allen.
Great. Thanks, Chip. So, okay, you've got a use case that you want to do. You've put it through your legal reviews, and it is legally appropriate. The next piece you need to think about is, even if it's legally right, is it feel right ethically? Are there any public relations risk or issues with it? You know, you have to think through all of your stakeholders, and not if, but when, because anything you do does become public. Will there be any potential risk to the company, any reaction? The example that I'll use, which I think will bring this to light a little bit more, is one that came out of Europe several years back. Mercedes-Benz, their finance group, uses the data on the geolocation data of the vehicle. If a customer is a deadbeat, if they're not making their payments, and they've tried and it's time to repossess the vehicle, which happens all the time in our industry. Companies spend hundreds, thousands of dollars sometimes to try and find that vehicle. It isn't always sitting at the location of record. So Mercedes started using the geolocation data to find it. Now, they made it very clear when the customers signed up, so that what they were doing, they signed off, they had consent. These are, you could argue, it's perfectly appropriate. These people who are not meeting their commitments on making their payments, and it is just much more cost effective to use the data. Well, it created a fairly large backlash. And as you can imagine, there's this creep factor, big brother factor, particularly with geolocation data. So yeah, you could say everything about this felt right. You still have to put it through an assessment. Is it something that you really want to do or not? Do people go all sorts of places in their vehicle? Do they want someone to know where they're always driving? So number two, assess the ethical and PR issues. Okay. Next, number three is do not use data to harm your customers. It is there to help your customers where possible. There are so many good examples of use cases that we can now do to help people, providing them additional services to get to their location more quickly, more effectively, how to do it at much lower cost, conveniences, how to pay for their coffee online and at the gas pump, and you hear about all the handshake issues at the EV chargers between the vehicle and the chargers. All of that can be much more seamless using the connected data. Very personalized services. There's all sorts of very good things that we can do. There shouldn't be any time that you use the data that could potentially harm your customer. Now, let's talk about the example in the story, usage-based insurance. That is one that there's been a lot of traction. You've probably seen some of the ads in the past on TV from Allstate and all that. People are aware, and that's the key, that aware of this service. They are opting in for it. And quite frankly, they are driving many people knowing it are driving much more safely. And there is benefit to them if they do that. They get discounts on their insurance. There is, in this case, some risk. If they don't drive as well, they won't get the discounts, or they could pay more. But they're doing that fully informed and aware. So in that case, as long as there is this full consent and people are fully clear on it, that's okay. But beyond that, use data to help your customers. You should never use it to harm your customers. That gets us to the next one, which is a little bit different, might not be quite as at the forefront for many people. Sort of the corollary to do no harm is, where possible, use data to help for, as I said here, the greater good. There are a lot of ways in our industry to use data to make the world a better place, a safer place. I don't know about you, but a lot of folks always would love to have a job, a role where they are able to sort of give back and do good. This is one small way we can in our industry. And I really feel we have an obligation and a responsibility to use the data for things, whether it's identifying road hazards or intersections that have a much higher propensity for accidents, and ways to get there more efficiently and reduce accidents, and obviously decarbonize the world. I will give General Motors credit. Their vision of zero crashes, zero emissions, zero congestion is something that I was always proud of when I worked there, that was the mission. And data is the foundation that will help these things happen. So use data for good.
All right, so those rules, those 4 rules, were all addressing the should I use the data? So let's say we've gone through those things. We've decided that it's legal, it's ethical, it doesn't carry PR risk, it doesn't harm the customer, or potentially even provide some societal good, as Ellen mentioned. So the next section here then addresses, okay, once I've made that decision that I'm going to use the data, how can I go about doing that in a way that is responsible in terms of management of that customer data? So the next 3 rules address that section. So rule number 5, you've got to determine what data to collect, to store, and to share. Every piece of data that you collect carries with it cost and risk. There's cost to pull it from the vehicle, there's cost to transmit it, there's cost to store it, there's cost to manage that storage, and there's risk at every step along the way. There's risk of hackers getting to the data. There's risk of loss. There's risk of misuse. There's risk, across the board. So when it's in the vehicle, when it's being transmitted, when it's being stored, and when it's being utilized. So the first thing you've got to do when looking at this use case, I've decided this is a great use case. What is the data I actually need for that? Cars can generate so much data, and not every piece is applicable for every use case. If I'm looking at a UBI use case, maybe it doesn't matter, the data that's being generated about the air fuel ratio in the engine, right? It's not relevant to that particular use case. So limiting your collection, your transmission, and your storage based on the data that is needed for these approved use cases can help limit your cost, and it can help limit your risk. One of the ways that we can continue to minimize cost and risk is to use edge computing. The more of the data that can stay in the vehicle and be processed in the vehicle, the less data has to be transmitted and stored externally, and the less risk there is, the less cost there is. So that's just one of the technology advances that can help with ensuring that we don't expose more data than necessary to risk and generate cost for OEMs that isn't required by the use case.
Okay, so the next one, this one is probably one of the more difficult or gray areas that we're going to talk about, and that's sort of balancing how you capture consent. Often when we had a potential use case, you start to pull it together, talk to the attorneys. Can we do it? Can we do it? Is this something that we're allowed to do? Heard a lot of no's all frequently. But one of the comments you would hear is, most anything you can do with consent. And that's the key, clear, proper consent. But then that gets you to the question of how frequently and how often can you ask for that? You don't want to every single use case, because there are dozens, hundreds that companies are working on. You don't want to, on each and every one, have to ask the customer to read through all the fine print and sign it and sign on the dotted line. So you get to this issue of what's the right way to do it. And listen, even to do that is very difficult from a technology perspective, to know which ones they've opted in for, which they haven't, and how to activate upon that. So it's a fine line. A couple of thoughts, rules of thumb is as follows. One, if you're not sure, err on the side of greater transparency and higher frequency, asking for consent for that specific use case. Again, you can't do it too frequently, but I will say the regulators, the courts, they are moving towards more is better than less. Second is the way we think about it is having different levels of permission probably can get you 90% of the way there. So here we've said 3. It could be 2 levels, it could be 4, it doesn't matter. But let's say you've got 3. Level 1 is just the basic to offer whatever service it is. You want to have the app with the remote start. Everyone loves to start their car on a cold day or cool it down on a hot day. Just providing consent so that you can offer the basic service. The next level might be that, plus you're asking for additional data elements, but that's going to allow you to offer different, greater levels of service. So you're asking for more, but you're providing more. And that could be things like letting the customer know that, they need to start their car 15 minutes earlier today because it's snowing out, or they're low on fuel or low on charge, things like that, which are really great benefits. You need some additional data for that. And then there might be this highest level. And in this case, it probably would include geolocation data. And you make it very clear that you're asking for that. But that is going to allow you to give these greater levels of services. So there's value to the customer, but making it very clear. Those 3 sort of basic levels should get you hopefully 90% of the way there. And then if there is some use case that's novel or does have potential risk, call it usage-based insurance, that's one that absolutely does require separate standalone consent so that the customer knows what they're doing. And then again, always will say, seek counsel from your attorneys on any use case.
All right, so that brings us to rule number 7. We've talked about should you use the data, and we've talked about how do you use the data. Well, let's get into the practical aspect of utilizing the data. So we've made all the right decisions up to this point. It's a good ethical use case. We've got consent. That's fantastic, but you still have to execute properly. Otherwise, you're exposing yourself and your customers to additional risk. Cybersecurity is the first and most obvious one that comes up here. Customer data has got to be protected. There are bad actors out there, and those bad actors are evolving just as quickly as all of the tools to stop them. So you've got to have robust cybersecurity practices internally within your company, in transmission and transit to other companies, and you've got to ensure that everybody in the ecosystem also has robust cybersecurity practices. So it's not something that you can do in a bubble. You've got to have cybersecurity standards and practices that apply to anybody that you're going to do business with around customer data. Is the risk of breaches, and we see breaches every day in multiple industries. We've seen the US government recently hacked and everybody's social security numbers being exposed. So the risks are out there, and those risks can very, very quickly outweigh any value that you're generating from the data that you're using to the customer and the value to the OEM. So you've got to have really good cybersecurity in place. But the second aspect of this is your own internal controls. Any of us that have worked in the auto industry is familiar with some kind of a project where, oh yeah, that was Bob's project. Bob is no longer with the company. Oh, that was Susan's project and she's in a different role now. And it sort of gets abandoned and sits on a shelf and gets dusty. You can't do that in this space. Somebody has to own that. You need regular reviews. You need transparent and accountable decision-making and management of your services. And you've got to have regular reviews because, as I mentioned earlier, the environment is constantly changing. If you just sort of launch and leave a program like this, you're exposing everybody to risk 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road when you're operating in a completely different environment than when you first initiated the project. So you've got to ensure that your internal controls are in place such that everything that is using customer data is a live project with a live owner with regular and rigorous reviews as the environment changes. So that gets us through the AMA 7 rules for data utilization. So we've talked about should you, you've talked about how should you. Now we're going to talk about what is that value that OEMs can generate from customer data. So, we've given some sort of broad categories, but once we've followed these 7 rules and we're ready to go, what kind of value can you generate? We can generate value for customers, for dealers, for partners, and Neikhil's going to talk a little bit about some of that value and how it can be generated.
Thank you, Chip. Thank you, Alan. And special thanks to George and the AMA team for setting this up together. But I think before we start, right, the main job that my team has at EXL is to take the data and AI visions that our clients have and bring them to reality, or at least ensure that we are able to execute on those visions with our clients and our partners. Now, when you think about all the 7 rules around the telemetry data or around the connected vehicle data that Chip and Alan talked about, one of the first steps to ensure that we are implementing it in the right way is gap assessment. So you need to start thinking about not gap assessment as a one-time exercise, but as a recurring exercise that you are doing on an ongoing basis with these 7 lenses to continue to refine your corporate strategy around the collection, usage, and storage of the telemetry data. Now, once you have your overarching organizational strategy in place on what exactly you want to do and what exactly you want to achieve, in order to bring this to life, there are 3 major components or 3 major initiatives that you should start thinking about. The first one is everything that relates to infrastructure design, architecting, and deploying. Now, anything that you want to do in this space, the first thing that you need to do is to figure out what is the infrastructure that you want to use. And nobody will be ever be able to get the infrastructure right in the first go. Right? I think the way you should think about it is it's an evolving journey. Right? Like one of the use cases where we were implementing or designing infrastructure for one of the leading OEMs, one of the challenge that we found was they had everything on their on-prem infrastructure. And when they started the deployment of the project, the entire initiative was under the assumption that we'll continue to keep our existing infrastructure and start developing the use cases on top of it with the minor tweaks. But somewhere around the project, there was an executive decision that was made that, moving to cloud is the next big thing. And we do not want to, use on-prem data assets or on-prem infrastructure for this initiative. And probably that was one of the major reasons why the project went to a failure, which was in flight, in the between of the project, changes in the baseline infrastructure. The infrastructure that they had probably would be good enough to serve 70 to 80% of use cases because it was evaluated in that way when we actually started working. But during the project, during the time when the project was actually in the process of getting live, changing the infrastructure just threw the entire project off the map. So having the right infrastructure foundations for you to succeed is the first piece. But then the second piece is what is your data strategy and what is the data architecture? And as we are talking to our clients and prospects in the auto space, this is one of the biggest challenges that they are asking, which is we are collecting this huge amount of data from our vehicles, and we do not know how to structure the data, what to do with the data, and how to actually use the data to generate value. That is the biggest problem the OEMs are facing at this point of time. And one of the things that we continue to recommend them is don't look at it as a data engineering problem. It is not a data engineering problem. Only 10 to 20% of the problem is a data engineering problem. If you are trying to create your medallion structure for this telemetry data to ensure that any and every use case that you might want to think about can be served by this medallion architecture, you are looking at it in the wrong way. You might want to look at what are the use cases you want to drive using your data and work backwards. Select 2 or 3 very important, very critical hero use cases and build your data and your infrastructure to serve those use cases specifically with the caveat that they should be scalable. They should be modular enough and they should be scalable enough so that if you are adding additional use cases, you should be able to scale the platform. But if you are building the platform right from a big bang approach, that the platform and the data architecture should be done in the way that it will serve any and every possible use cases, the data engineering itself is going to take years and years, and you will never be able to reach the end outcome. The final bucket is, what are the use cases? Now, as you are thinking about use cases, I think Alan and Chip covered it well, that ultimately all the use cases converge into one single benefit. How your product is utilized by your customers and what is the customer experience that it is driving. But in order to achieve that ultimate objective, we are seeing three major buckets of use cases that the OEMs are driving. The first one is anything and everything that relates to interacting with your customers directly. So that includes, customer experience, customer safety, or you have, it's really hot out there. Do you want to, turn on the AC before you go, and so on and so forth. The second big bucket is enabling the dealership to serve better your customers. And as you think about, your customer coming to the dealership, one of the biggest challenge that the OEMs face is probably the lack of control in terms of the customer experience that your customers are having when they actually go and visit the dealership. How much time their car is in the service station? Once the car has been serviced, what is the performance of the car? Is there a repeat issues that you are seeing in the cars even after the service? How is the dealership actually communicating with the customers if and in the scenario that those issues are recurring issues? So a lot of work is happening in the areas where you are enabling your dealership to serve better your customers, to take the control back in terms of what is the experience that your customers are having in the dealership that they go and visit. And the last bucket is, how do you use this data to obviously do good, but then also to monetize the data in the partnership ecosystem? So these are the three major use cases that are driving the execution of the final scenario on where you want to reach with your telemetry data. I'll take a pause and Chip, back to you.
Great, thanks, Neikhil. So actually, I'll pass it back to George at this point. That's the prepared material that we've got. I think George now is going to have some questions for all of us.
Super. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate you walking through all that. And again, this white paper is at the AutomobilityAdvisors.com website. You can download it. Please visit if you haven't done it already. A couple of questions, I think, to kick us off. Chip, I'm going to start with you. You talked about, kind of how to do it within the auto context. I'm just thinking about people that are driving cars are obviously smartphone users. They're used to data. They're used to sharing their data. Some would say oversharing. And so in the world of data use and sharing and updates, they have that pretty much covered with their smartphone. Then they get in their vehicle, and the vehicle now is also a connected device, but it's a very different thing, an automobile, than a smartphone. So maybe give us some ideas about, the particular things that the automotive industry has to think about relative to all the different details to deal with data for automotive.
Yeah, and there's a different set of data that you can get from a vehicle than what you can get from a phone. And first off is the ability to get the data, right? So yes, everybody's got phones these days, but everybody also has phones that the batteries die because they've been on the phone all day long. So maybe they've got a dead battery, or they haven't paired the phone to the vehicle, or you've got different drivers in the vehicle. But the vehicle itself has got access to a lot of data that you can't get from your phone, or that you can get better than you can get from your phone, right? Better geolocation, more accurate, more accurate, accelerometers, things of that nature. And these, these types of data that you can get out of a vehicle can help around the actual experience of driving and using your vehicle, right? Your phone is optimized for getting you to use your phone. And it can be very convenient for, using, Apple Pay or something to go through Starbucks and buy your coffee. But when you look at things that are vehicle centric, there are all kinds of services around usage of your vehicle and of traveling, right? You know, be navigation and location based services, services around parking or charging or refueling your car, you know, things of that nature that are specifically transport specific are you know, often best served by the data that you can get in the vehicle. There's also usage that is valuable for the OEMs themselves, right? Usage of the different features and capabilities in the vehicle. What, you know, we're putting a lot of money into planning this vehicle and building all these features and capabilities. Is anybody using that? Is anybody changing the background colors in their IP system in front, you know, in the gauges in front of the driver, for example? So you can learn what is and isn't being used in the car. You can better maintain and operate the vehicle. So if you've got sensors or electronics that are going bad, or software that needs to be updated, or other potential maintenance issues, you can get that all from the vehicle. You can't get it from a phone. So there are plenty of value generation cases for the OEM, for the customer, and for you know, other entities, you know, governmental entities managing traffic, or you know, companies that are managing parking and parking garages or street parking, companies that are managing EV charging networks, that you can best support using data from a vehicle as opposed to data from a phone.
Right. Super. Yeah, it always struck me as odd that people would be hesitant sometimes sharing vehicle data because they don't want people to know where they are, yet they're Google and Apple are constantly aware of where they're walking around when they're using
Find my
their
phone.
phones.
Well, here you are. Yeah.
Right. Okay, great. Dan, I want to just bring you into the conversation as a you know, somebody who's worked in connected vehicle team, led a connected vehicle team at a major OEM. This is a big topic. Obviously, we talked about you know, the ethics and the legal and all that kind of stuff. And there's the technical side that we talked a little bit about, the differences in auto versus mobile. But there's probably other issues related to this that OEMs have to think about. I'm thinking about customer support and third-party relationships. You can't do it all yourself as the OEM. So what are the other things that you think are important for OEM teams who are doing this to think about?
Well, I think the heart of every OEM is a desire to deliver a great experience for their customers, whether it's a retail vehicle owner, a business owner, it doesn't matter. OEMs want those vehicle owners to love their products, love the experience of owning those products, do their servicing and stay within that OEM ecosystem, and then buy more from them. And that's no different than any other business. So now the OEM has this goal of, you know, doing great things for their customer, and how do they execute that best? So they need to look at things like the platform costs and the operational support costs, and making sure that all of those are designed and developed as best as they can be, and compare that to the return on the investment. Some of those are direct returns from a direct commerce kind of relationship where there's revenue derived that's very clear and easy to track. And then other things are more subtle, where you're improving your brand reputation, you're demonstrating a higher level of innovation so that your customers perceive you in a more positive light. You're able to get higher residual values on your products at their later stages of ownership, which helps your vehicle owners be in a better financial position, and also encourages others to, you know, believe strongly in your vehicle. So you have those kinds of objectives for the OEMs, and they're trying to figure out how to extract the most value from the services they've created. And there's a certain amount of capability they can do directly. Every OEM has a shortage at some point in the amount of money they're willing to invest, or people and time that they're willing to invest. So how do you balance that versus an open platform where the innovation is done externally? And that's where third parties come in, and that's a whole different kind of relationship that OEMs have to manage. Some have gone very deep into creating platforms and relationships with third parties, either directly with an external company that creates a user experience, or indirectly through an aggregator who takes care of the complexity and does the connections with multiple companies like that. And those can help enhance the speed of execution, but then it also requires that OEMs are careful on who they allow their data to go out to, make sure that they have very explicit and active consent management processes, so that if a customer does connect their vehicle to some external source, that they know who they connected it to, they know what it's used for, they have an easy ability to disconnect it. And the OEMs that are at the sort of forefront of this, they're building this recording mechanism and management mechanism into their OEM apps. They're having preferred partners that make it easy to sign up, easy to disconnect. And they do that with a very clear, transparent communication of what data is being used and why. And if the customer changes their mind, they can disconnect it and then they can reconnect it when they want.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Allen, next question to you. You have a very unique background in that you work with an OEM, but prior you also worked with automotive dealers. We talked about third parties just now. Dan did. I might consider the OEM the first party. Does that mean the dealer's the second party? Because I don't really consider dealers as third party in their relationship with the OEM. But is the burden only on the OEM to do all this and take care of this as carefully as possible? Or is there a role for the dealer? Is there an opportunity for the dealer to participate and get a lot of value out of all this?
Sure. No, good question. And the answer is absolutely. There is plenty of value. I know Neikhil talked about sort of dealer enablement as one of the areas of benefit. As you think about it, the OEMs are certainly the ones who have the ready access to the data. So they're certainly in a position to help and work with their dealers. I guess you could argue there are times where dealers might be able to, put a dongle in the vehicle or use maybe some of the not telemetry data, the cell phone based, but for all intents and purposes, they certainly need to work with the OEMs and the dealers together. My hope is that will happen and will continue to happen and will continue to grow. Now, listen, we all know there's forever in our industry the issue of who owns the customer. And, as far as I'm concerned, it's joint. I've worked on both sides. You have to work together. But there are certainly, there's been times of question in the past and lack of trust between some OEMs and dealers. It's always been that way. I do believe that working together, there are enormous opportunities. Certainly in the whole area of predictive service. As we all know, service is an enormously high margin business. Using the data to not only predict an oil change, which is a little bit easier to do these days, things like knowing a battery is about to go bad, knowing that the brakes are legitimately nearing their end. Enormous value for the customer and for the dealer with the OEM working together. Chip mentioned about sort of the infrastructure of the phones. These days the phone does so much for customers, the least of which is talking to another human being. I think the vehicle is now viewed as that next front, and that's why a lot of this focus on connected vehicles. So great opportunities for dealers if when they sell the next car, the customer gets in and it is just set for them the way they want, with all of their stations preset, with all of their contacts on to make their quick calls, to the seats, everything, just like you might get with your phone today. It used to be a real pain every time you wanted a new phone getting it set. These days it's so nice. That keeps me with my phone provider. We can certainly get to the same issue with the vehicle. So a lot of loyalty opportunities for the dealer. The last piece I'll say is that the sort of the holy grail for me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, is how do we have that 360-degree view of our customers, have all of their data, both at the OEM level as well at the dealer level together in one place so that we can truly do personalized communications, much more cost-effective advertising for folks, eventually AI-informed or driven next best actioning, a lot of opportunities working together for both the dealer and the OEM.
Great, super. Thank you, Alan. And Neikhil, last question to you, and then we'll move to audience. You talked about the gap assessment, right? Figuring out where you are and what you need to do. You talked about the data strategy and then the use cases. What are the kinds of areas, and you also talked about an example of somebody moving to cloud and how that kind of didn't help the situation. My guess is you've also been involved in many very successful deployments. What are the things that those did right, and where are the areas that EXL helps those clients make this happen?
Definitely. Thank you, George. So I think when we think about the experience that we have working with our clients, right, I think there are two broad value add that we bring to the table. The first one is the knowledge and SME, and the ability to not reinvent the wheel every time every OEM implements a particular use case, right? So somebody is ahead of the journey, somebody is currently in the process of early stages of their journey, and the companies that are in early stages of their journey can actually take the learnings from other companies that have actually implemented it well. So that is one of the things that we bring to the table as we are working across multiple OEMs and multiple clients. The second value add that we bring to the table is primarily around accelerations or use cases that gives you a leg up when you start working on the project. So there are some basic accelerators that we have in place, both in terms of the infra design, what are the type of infrastructure that will work for specific type of use cases, basic data ETL loads and architectures on these are the ways you might want to structure your data for these particular type of use cases. So having some of those pre-built accelerators in place to help our clients to start their project in the way that at least to cut down the initial planning phase when they are actually starting the project.
Great, super.
Now, just one last point, George. As we think about security, right? One of the other trends that we are seeing and learning is the movement from DevOps process to DevSecOps process, right? So as we think about the evolution of security in today's umbrella, right? Having a view of security throughout the entire development and operations process is also important. So that's another learnings and another area where we would recommend people to start considering if they are not already doing it.
No, that's a great point. No, great point. Thank you very much, Neikhil. Dan, we have a few minutes left. I know we have some excellent comments in the chat and some questions. Any particular questions that you'd like to surface for the group?
So there have been a few questions that have come in around how can companies connect to OEMs and how can they, what could it enable that to be easier? So questions about standards, things like Matter as a standardized methodology for making these kind of connections. And then there's other companies that do this work, such as EXL, their smart card that I also work at. And those kinds of approaches can reduce the amount of effort that's required on both sides, both from the OEM side and then whether it's an infrastructure project trying to do vehicle to grid, or if it is a third-party company trying to create a mobility service or a usage-based insurance banking platform. And initially the resources are slim, and then these aggregators and integrators take some of that complexity out, because right now it is very complex and there isn't a general standard that goes across all of the different OEMs to make it easy for you and your company to make one connection and then transport that over to every other OEM. So we had a number of those. I've answered a bit of that in the chat as well. but there is this question about edge computing, and maybe Chip, this would be a good one for you to talk about. Is there another way aside from managing this in the cloud or through standards, but a way to deliver more value through edge computing to enhance the safety and capability of the data that you're collecting in the car?
Sure. And I think, edge computing is a really interesting future path for automotive. It's in its infancy now because as they exist today, the vehicles on the road, most of them don't have a lot of excess compute capacity or excess storage that you need for edge computing. But as more of that capability gets built into vehicles, there are OS companies that are building edge computing platforms for in the vehicle. So QNX, for example, and others. And there are companies now that are beginning to develop edge computing capabilities that can be built into a vehicle. So for example, Motor, who we worked with, has an edge computing capability to generate scores for insurance companies. So instead of sending all of this sensitive geolocation data out of the vehicle and time of use and acceleration and braking and so on, they do the computation on board and simply send a score that says, Dan gets an 84 for today off board, which vastly reduces the data risk in terms of transmission and storage. There are other companies that do calculations for managing the maintenance of a vehicle. So you look at the data usage or the vehicle usage and the driving habits and patterns, and you can predict whether your tires are going to need to be replaced or your brakes are going to need to be replaced earlier or later based on use. But you don't have to send all of that data off board. It's managed in the vehicle, and you simply send small amounts of specific focused data out off of the vehicle. So it's a nascent technology right now, but you're starting to see a lot more companies get involved. And as vehicles themselves become more capable and have more excess capacity on board, the ability to take advantage of that for a number of use cases is just going to increase.
And Neikhil, if I could ask you next, from your perspective, seeing what's happening across the industry, not just in automotive, but in other industries, are there certain standards or approaches to standards that seems to work better that could be applied to automotive and allow automotive to accelerate some of these processes to reduce the risk and then maybe reduce the data transport costs and other things that comes from collecting maybe too much data and sending too much when you don't need all of it?
Sure. So Dan, I think one of the challenges with standards is, companies realizing where they are and where they should be, right? So one of the desire for the companies is obviously to own the entire ecosystem, right? To own the entire horizontal stack. But over the period of time, as they continue to take a stab at it, right? They continue to learn and evolve that some parts of the ecosystem might actually be better, to start adopting as a standard. And I think one of the points that you mentioned around, let's say, EV charging, right, is originally when it was starting, right, there were no standards in place. Then suddenly, a couple of OEMs came together. There was a small standard that started building. And then, there was one company, Tesla, that was just building a thing on its own, but what was far ahead in terms of how they were doing it. And essentially that became the industry standard. So when companies are in their early stages of journey for a particular ecosystem, everyone will try their own thing. And then one product or a couple of products will come out that will be significantly ahead of the competition. And those products are the ones that will start driving the standards. So I think coming to a standard is part of the maturity. As you move ahead in the maturity curve, you start converging into one or a couple of standards. Ideally, the preference should be that there should be a couple of standards so that the competition exists in the market.
Got it. Dan, we just have a couple more seconds. Any last questions we might answer?
There's a couple questions or comments that have floated through regarding ATSC, which is a television spectrum multicasting. So I guess maybe this one for George. aside from the fact that that's one way typically to the vehicle, how could that help in this case? And are there any other aspects related to vehicle, which has always been difficult to execute?
Right. I think it's really interesting using TV towers to send data to moving vehicles, right? This is a new kind of frontier. We're used to wireless, we're used to Wi-Fi, but we're not used to necessarily broadcast. And when I think of broadcast, I think about very, very localization capability within, TV tower can go 50 miles or something. So, in a metro area, you have very specific local capabilities, but also kind of background passive sending data to vehicles, map updates, all kinds of things where your car is continuously being refreshed because you're, kind of basking in that TV signal that's sending data to your car, and it can do it very inexpensively. So from an OEM point of view, it's an incredibly cost-effective strategy. Now, it's not necessarily a two-way strategy, an interactive strategy, but it's a really good way to get data to vehicles. So I think that's kind of a new frontier. There's lots of work happening in that world. People should investigate ATSC 3.0, but we're really excited to be working in that space as well.
Then I'll just add one other quick comment. I know we're at time, but Ted has put a comment out there about an industry effort to try to drive some of the standardization that we just talked about through Covisa. So there's some links that are in the chat. So if any participants here haven't checked out the chat window, there's a few links that you might want to explore on your time.
And thank you, Maricela, for posting the paper, the link to the paper in the chat. So it's very convenient. We appreciate that. So let me close by just thanking everybody. Really appreciate everybody joining, being interested in the topic. Our team, Dan Teeter, Chip Goetzinger, Allen Levenson, thank you for your leadership. And Neikhil, really appreciate your involvement and comments from EXL. Again, everybody, you can download the paper at automobilityadvisors.com. The recording will be made available in the next few hours, hopefully. So you should be able to take a look at it again. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and really appreciate you joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.